Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. The forgotten man of the heavyweight division, WBC mandatory Dominic Breazeale, is lashing out at the WBC. So finally, after waiting the best part of a year for his mandatory shot, he's biting the hand that feeds. So I'll get to the quotes from Dominic Breazeale and then a few thoughts, because Breazeale, certainly he's in a tricky position. He hasn't been treated well, he's been waiting, and he could continue to wait for a shot at the WBC belt holder for potentially the best part of another year. That is, if he maintains his mandatory position, or whatever the situation is with the WBC, and a ruling it will issue soon, and more on that later. But the quotes from Dominic Breazeale, as on boxingscene.com, see on screen here: "I'm upset that I have to wait. I understand a rematch is already in the works right now because of the situation with the draw, which benefits Wilder." And certainly the WBC has, been pretty open about that. On its website, it said this, said a statement here, effectively approving the rematch, saying, "We're going to allow this to happen. We'll come up with a ruling to deal with the Breazeale situation, the mandatory situation." And in terms of Mauricio Sulaiman, so he is quoted here as saying, "I've been on record for more than a year about Joshua, and I've been supporting Joshua to fight for the WBC title to unify the heavyweight division. Unfortunately, it didn't happen when it could have happened. Both fighters took the wrong route, but the WBC will continue to support the idea of unification. But the WBC has ruled in favour of a Wilder-Fury rematch, and we have our mandatory contender situation that also has to be addressed. I'm certain that Joshua will eventually fight for the WBC championship in the near future, and I'm certain that the heavyweight division will have interest in it that we have been waiting for decades. There are great fights to be done in 2019, and hopefully all of the fighters that have been mentioned will be involved in the WBC championship." And that statement, as the article suggests, angers Breazeale. He is quoted as saying, "The actual thought of the WBC president already sanctioning the fight, and that he wants Anthony Joshua to fight for his heavyweight championship. I understand you want all of the top heavyweights to fight for your belt, but you kind of have to draw a line. I'm the WBC mandatory, therefore I should get the next title shot and not be pushed aside because the WBC president wants to see another opponent fight for the WBC belt." And further on, Dominic Breazeale continues, "I'd like to sit down in front of Mauricio and say, hey, can you tell me how this ranking system works? Because I've sat and waited my turn, yet you rank me number 4, but you call me the WBC mandatory. I mean, shouldn't I be ranked number 1? I would just ask him to explain that to me because, I've been the WBC mandatory for a little over 13 months. And on that mandatory situation, he actually has been the mandatory for effectively 13 months, but that wasn't confirmed till about 9 months ago. He kept coming out with hints earlier in 2018 saying, Deontay Wilder, come on, fight me, and I'm your mandatory. And people were going, well, what's this based on? That fight you had with Eric Molina in late 2017 was just an eliminator. And there had been some public sort of signals from the WBC to indicate that. But clearly Dominic Breazeale had either taken some legal advice or spoken to the WBC about some sort of remedy of that nature, because eventually he was confirmed as the mandatory. And it was a messy situation. Originally he was meant to fight Berman Stavern, but Stavern was elevated to fight Deontay Wilder because Stavern was Wilder's mandatory, and that was after Luis Ortiz failed a drug test. So Breazeale fighting Molina, that was considered a final eliminator, but not confirmed as such till later on. And it was really messy at the time because the WBC, even in its own website, was changing the situation from final eliminator to eliminator. There were mixed signals coming out, and Eddie Hearn had said he had spoken to Mauricio Sulaiman, who had guaranteed Breazeale wasn't the mandatory. Anyway, that was a whole messy situation, but it doesn't change the fact Dominic Breazeale is the mandatory and has been the mandatory for some time. And this whole thing about him being ranked number 4 in the WBC, this has been a bit of a bugbear for me because I can't explain it either. Just like Breazeale, it leaves me scratching my head. He's the guy that is set to face, the WBC title holder next. Well, potentially next. Potentially at some point, he's got a guaranteed shot, but he's ranked number 4. So he's had the likes of Tyson Fury overtake him, Luis Ortiz. I don't even know how Ortiz got ahead of him, because Ortiz, at the point that he was elevated above Dominic Breazeale, had only had the Razvan Kajanu fight. I think the situation with the number one spot, I think that was more political than anything. Boxing politics. Dillian Whyte had been the number one rated fighter. He'd beaten the guys that had been in front of him. He held the silver title. He'd had a number of sanctioned WBC fights. And then Dominic Breazeale, with 2 wins since his loss to Anthony Joshua, one of them somehow became a final eliminator. He was all of a sudden named the mandatory. And that was a bizarre situation in itself, but it is what it is. But I do think that is why Dominic Breazeale hasn't been elevated to number one, because Dillian Whyte has continued to win. He beat Joseph Parker, who was very highly rated in the WBC at the time they fought. He's maintained his position. He's still got the silver title. And who knows, maybe a Breazeale and Whyte fight will be ordered if they win over the weekend. We'll have to see. The WBC has to create a ruling to deal with Breazeale's situation if it is to sanction the Wilder and Fury rematch, which it says it's approving that fight. It's approving that to go ahead next. It is going to deal to that situation by coming up with a ruling. But if a Joshua fight came on the horizon after that rematch, it sounds like, from what Mauricio Suleiman is saying, Dominic Breazeale, if he still maintains the mandatory status or whatever, he's just going to have to continue to wait. And obviously that is really bugging the guy. He's become a forgotten man in the division. He's been waiting for his shot all year. And remember, there's been a number of things that have gone on. Deontay Wilder talked about Dominic Breazeale's son, saying he wanted to look into his eyes because, he wanted his son to see the man that was going to cripple his dad. I mean, at the time, that was seen as a pretty sort of low sort of blow. Dominic Breazeale was very frustrated, very angry at those statements, and he did that infamous response from driving in his car where he was just chewing out Wilder.
You ain't shit. For one man to talk about another man's son and to talk about crippling a man in the ring, you ain't nothing, man. Your life is all f***ed up. You want to come at me with some bullshit? Be a man. Step up. Get the paperwork done. Send the contract over.
And obviously the two have beef going further back. After his February 2017 fight, Deontay Wilder and his entourage, well, it was more the entourage, got into it with Dominic Breazeale at the hotel after the fight. So Dominic Breazeale, was beaten up a little bit, and he was threatening court action. He wanted to take Deontay Wilder and his entourage, all that sort of stuff, to court. So there was a big situation going on behind the scenes there. He's got a lot of beef with Wilder, and there's been a lot of jibes since then. Wilder said a few things, that how he would deal to Breazeale and such, and obviously the cripple your daddy comments. And Breazeale's just been sitting, waiting, gathering dust, not fighting, not getting a purse coming in to feed his family, all that sort of stuff. And now he's got his first fight of 2018 at the end of 2018. And who knows what's going to happen next, because the WBC in its ruling, it could actually order Breazeale and Dillian Whyte, or order Breazeale and Luis Ortiz, depending on who was available for a fight, could order them to fight for an interim title. They're going to have to do something to address the situation. And who knows, maybe we're going to see another championship belt created out of thin air to satisfy this unfortunate situation. But Dominic Breazeale, sitting on the bench, not doing much. He says he's been working out in the gym, and we've been seeing that on social media as well. But, he's going to have some ring rust. I do expect him to get past Carlos Negron. But this whole situation been very unfortunate. And I can understand his frustrations here with the WBC, which is noted for basically writing its own rules on the spot, crossing them out and rewriting them as it suits itself. Just remember that whole Berman-Stavern situation. How was he made the mandatory? Somehow rising the ranks. He had one fight in 2 years. He was due to have an eliminator with Povetkin, but there was that failed test. But even in spite of that, they shouldn't have elevated Stavern to that mandatory position. There should have been another final eliminator or something. So the WBC often it goes off, does whatever it likes, and people are left carrying the can, and Breazeale is in that situation. I feel for the guy. Forgotten man in the division in 2018. Let's hope he does get some good luck for himself running in 2019. And in spite of the situation surrounding him and the murky circumstances around him getting the mandatory shot, you want to see these guys fight. And if Dominic Breazeale is really good enough, we want to see him in with decent contenders, or at the very least getting that title shot sometime in 2019. He has earned it, albeit under fishy circumstances, but the guy is one of the top 15 boxers in the world. He's the number 4 in the WBC despite being the mandatory, but he deserves to be in some fights in his prime because otherwise he's being robbed of an opportunity to earn a livelihood, and that there is not good. And the WBC is putting money and prestige and other things ahead of Breazeale here, and it's very clear from their behaviour. So good on him for actually biting the hand that feeds. Well, because they're not feeding him right now, are they? But good on him for actually having a crack, because someone needs to have a crack at these guys because it's a dodgy situation and has been. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often, hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.